Why do schools teach fairness, honesty, and respect, while the real world rewards whoever knows the hidden rules faster? Why does a child grow up memorizing moral ideals, then get thrown into adult life and suddenly discover that the game has different rules, different scoring, different penalties? The uncomfortable truth is this: nobody wants to admit that morality is not the default setting of society. Morality is trained, and hidden rules are learned in the dark. You've probably felt it yourself. Maybe it was your first job where you learned that competence is not the only currency. Maybe it was a relationship where be yourself turned into don't say that. It makes things awkward. Maybe it was money where budgeting and discipline were praised in theory, but the people with real influence were doing something else entirely. And you started to wonder whether the values you were taught were childish or whether adults just got better at pretending. So here is what this video will do. I'm going to pull back the curtain on why education doesn't teach you the society's unspoken contracts. I'm going to show you what moral training is actually trying to protect. And then I'm going to tell you the part most people refuse to face. If you grow up believing the only survival strategy is manipulation, you will not become realistic. You will become smaller, meaner, more hollow, more controllable. Let's start with a simple, everyday example. Imagine you walk into a clothing store. The sticker says 800. The salesperson smiles and says, "That's the price." You push, you negotiate, you get it down to 400. You walk out feeling proud, like you outsmarted the system. Then one day you find out the original price was never 800. It was 100, and the entire theater was designed to make you participate in your own feeling of victory. That's not just a store trick, that's a psychological mechanism. You were given a story where you could feel in control, while the real control remained with someone else. Now take that feeling and scale it to ethics. School morality works like an ethical high price. It isn't there to trick you into being naive. It's there to give you an ideal to compare against when reality gets confusing. If school taught the exact hidden rules immediately, the child would not learn morality. The child would learn the method for bypassing morality. They would learn the moves. They would learn how to rationalize. They would learn which lies are socially acceptable. And then they would call it survival. But the child is not ready to separate adaptation from corruption. Not yet. You might think, if the world is ugly, why not teach kids the ugliness? That question sounds mature. It also ignores what growing minds are actually capable of. Early childhood is when identity is stitched together. The foundations of personality form before the person has enough self-distance to analyze contradictions. Children don't just absorb facts, they absorb meaning, they absorb tone, they absorb what is rewarded and what is punished, even when nobody says it out loud. In that early phase, most kids trust the adults around them like a default operating system. They believe the lesson because it comes wrapped in warmth. They believe fairness because fairness is modeled as a virtue, not because they've done a cost-benefit analysis of human cruelty. They accept honesty because telling the truth is treated as a moral strength, not as a handicap. This is why moral education in school doesn't primarily try to prepare children for the world's worst behavior. It tries to install a compass. A compass is not the map. It doesn't show every street. It tells you which direction north is. Later, when the child becomes an adult and the city turns out to be filled with traps, the compass can still guide them toward a boundary. If you remove the compass too early, you don't create realism. You create a person who thinks the world has no dignity, so dignity is optional, and that is where the hidden rules become addictive. Let's go deeper into what makes hidden rules different from moral ideals. Hidden rules are not just bad behavior, they are systems that reward emotional dishonesty, strategic cruelty, and selective empathy. They create incentives for performance rather than integrity. You can live in that world for years and still call yourself a good person, because the hidden rules allow you to lie without the burden of guilt. They offer you loopholes. For example, a child can be taught, tell the truth, be kind, treat people fairly. But the adult world often runs on a different script. Don't offend the person with power. Don't make the meeting uncomfortable. Don't state what you really think unless you want consequences. In the workplace, you can be right and still lose. You can be moral and still get punished. And if a child doesn't have a moral baseline, what happens when they see that contradiction? They likely conclude morality doesn't work. Or worse, morality is for fools. That conclusion is one of the main entry points for the dark transformation people rarely admit. Once the child concludes morality is ineffective, they start optimizing for outcomes instead of character. And optimization is how manipulation becomes normal. Now think about the micro moments. When you were young, you might have learned that a compliment should be sincere. You might have learned that saying something nice requires care. But in social environments full of status anxiety, many people learn an entirely different lesson. Say what keeps the peace. Say what maintains your position. Say what prevents backlash. And that can look harmless at first. But repeated lying to manage social comfort trains the emotional muscles. You start practicing disconnection. You start treating people like instruments. You start replacing empathy with strategy. And then one day you realize you don't just lie sometimes. You've built a whole identity around appearing acceptable while withholding truth. This is where school morality plays its real role. It doesn't deny the existence of hidden rules. It delays full exposure until the student has enough emotional stability to interpret it without collapsing into cynicism. The goal is not innocence. The goal is survival of a self that can still feel. Because if you expose a child to adult-level deception before they can regulate their own feelings, you don't teach resilience. You teach disgust. You teach suspicion. You teach them to preemptively protect themselves by becoming what they fear. That's the first psychological truth. Moral ideals taught early are not naive. They are protective scaffolding. If the scaffolding is removed too soon, the child doesn't build a sturdier house. They just freeze, or they start building with whatever toxic materials they can find. The second truth is more uncomfortable. Hidden rules spread mainly through trauma, family dysfunction, and social imitation. People don't become manipulative because they studied psychology. They become manipulative because they learned that trust is dangerous. They learned it through experience that adults refuse to interpret for them. Some children grow up in chaotic homes. They learn that kindness is temporary. They learn that love can vanish. They learn that anger is unpredictable. They learn that their needs cause conflict. In that world, pretending becomes safety. Silence becomes safety. And eventually, they stop believing in the moral language adults use. They stop believing fairness because fairness never arrived. Others grow up with a more subtle poison. Parents may speak about love and ethics, but they model conditional affection. They praise obedience, but punish honesty. They reward performance, but mock vulnerability. They call it discipline, but it's really control. The child watches this pattern long enough and learns the real rule. The truth is only safe when it serves the adult's comfort. So when these children later enter school and hear about honesty, they might want to believe. But part of them knows the cost. They begin to split themselves. They become two people. The person who says the good things and the person who privately calculates risk. And here is the moment where hidden rules become a personality. Once you're used to splitting, you develop a talent for reading power. You learn which emotions are acceptable. You learn how to soften reality to keep your position. You learn how to punish quietly. Then you grow up and you act surprised when the world is cruel. But it wasn't surprise, it was pattern recognition. You just never called it a pattern. Psychological research and criminology studies often point to early distorted moral foundations as a major risk factor in later antisocial behavior. Not because childhood directly creates evil, childhood creates templates. Those templates shape what a person believes is normal. If a child is raised in an environment where empathy is mocked and domination is rewarded, the person doesn't merely choose wrongdoing later. They follow their learned map. And that map is built in childhood long before any teacher says crime is wrong. The child already knows which emotions matter and which emotions get you hurt. This is why the foundation of moral education is so critical. A child trained on high ideals can still fail. They can still get tempted. But the internal signal exists. They have something to return to. It becomes harder to cross certain lines because the person feels the loss in advance. A tree that is trained early, bent carefully while young, may curve under a storm later, but it doesn't collapse into nonsense. Its direction still matters. A person without that early training can become radically flexible in the wrong way. They can reshape their values overnight, not out of growth, but out of survival panic. So yes, adults want to say that education should be realistic. But realistic what? Realistic cynicism? Realistic deception? Realistic betrayal? There is a difference between preparing a person for complexity and training them to normalize corruption. This brings us to the third truth. Adults don't teach the hidden rules because if they did, they would be legitimizing what they claim to condemn. Once hidden rules become official curriculum, they become a moral system. And society doesn't want to admit it runs on that system. It would collapse public trust. That's why school doesn't stand up and say, here is how you manipulate people politely. It doesn't say, here is how you exploit loopholes while staying technically legal. It doesn't say, here is how you win by stepping over others while maintaining a charming public image. Not because these skills don't exist, they exist. It avoids teaching them because the act of teaching is the act of normalization. If you teach a lie like it's strategy, you are not educating. You are endorsing. You are building the next generation of professionals in disguise. But society still needs people to operate within its hidden rules. So what happens instead? It becomes a trap of indirect learning. Children learn the hidden rules through experience, failure, humiliation, and shocks. They discover the gray zones only after they've invested trust and paid the price. And that is where adulthood starts feeling like a betrayal. The person expected the moral world to match the moral education. Then they learn that morality is not the dominant language of every room. Consider communication. In school, you're told to speak directly, to respect others, to be honest. In adult life, you often meet environments where respect means keeping the powerful comfortable. It means not naming the discomfort. It means avoiding certain topics. It means delivering the truth in a form that won't trigger punishment. So, a young adult might say something honest and get labeled difficult. Another person says nothing and gets rewarded. Another person tells a harmless lie and gets promoted. And if the person doesn't have a stable moral compass, they will conclude that honesty is stupid. They will start adjusting their speech until truth becomes optional. Then they wonder why they feel empty, because they trained themselves to live without inner alignment. Now consider fairness. Schools insist that fairness is the highest standard. Grades reflect effort. Work rewards competence. Friendship is based on sincerity. Then adulthood hits and reveals favoritism, nepotism, networks, and inherited advantage. You learn that opportunities travel through relationships. You learn that some people never have to fight for what others must earn. What do young adults do with this knowledge? There are two routes. One route is mature. You recognize unfairness without surrendering your ethics. You keep your integrity while strategizing. You advocate where you can. You choose partners and employers carefully. You accept that the world is messy, but you refuse to become a weapon. The other route is the collapse route. You decide fairness is fiction. You stop believing in merit. You start believing in exploitation. You begin to treat other humans like currency. And the hidden rules are designed to push people toward the collapse route because that route is easier for social systems to manage. A cynical person is predictable. A manipulator is easier to control than a principled person. A principled person asks questions and creates friction. A cynical person adapts quietly and becomes compliant. Now consider the gray zone of law and morality. On paper, law looks clean. Permit this, ban that. But in reality, there are huge areas where people exploit technicalities. A business can market something while misleading the customer in subtle ways. A company can underpay labor while staying within narrow definitions. Someone can claim legality while violating the spirit of decency. School tells children stealing is wrong, lying is wrong, fraud is wrong, but it doesn't teach every loophole and every moral camouflage because that would mean teaching children how to find those loopholes. It would mean giving them a map to harm. So instead, the person learns gray zones later. They learn them when they're hired, when they sign contracts, when they witness office politics, when they see how advertising reshapes reality. And again, the learning can go two ways. If the person has a moral base, they learn gray zones as threats. They develop boundaries. They refuse certain deals even if they're legal. They feel the discomfort and listen to it. They may become cautious, but not cruel. If the person lacks that moral base, gray zones become training grounds. They adopt the idea that if it's legal, it's fine. If it's socially accepted, it must be okay. They start bargaining away their conscience in small steps until the conscience becomes numb. That numbness is not maturity. It's erosion. Next is competition and survival masks. Schools teach cooperation. They hang posters about teamwork. They tell you that no one grows alone. Then you step into adult life and discover that competition can be ruthless. In the office, people smile while counting your mistakes. In the marketplace, rivals shake hands and later destroy each other's reputations. In politics, loyalty can be a performance. If children are taught that domination is the only truth, they develop an identity built on taking. They become the person who sees the world as a chessboard, where the weakest must be removed. They lose the ability to feel remorse because their worldview doesn't allow the category of innocence. But school doesn't teach this worldview. It teaches cooperation as an ideal. It does not claim cooperation always works. It claims cooperation is still worth choosing. It is planting a preference in the brain. And when adult life becomes harsh, the presence of that preference can change everything. It can prevent the person from turning every conflict into a purge. It can allow them to compete without becoming a predator. Finally, there is the most dangerous hidden rule of all, the social mask. School encourages sincerity. Children are told to be themselves. Adults even praise authenticity. But authenticity in adult life is often selective. Many people practice a split self because they need to avoid punishment. They need to maintain employment. They need to avoid conflict. They need to keep relationships stable, so they smile at the wrong times. They laugh at jokes that make them uncomfortable. They agree to policies they privately hate. They praise leaders they secretly resent, and because this behavior repeats, it becomes a skill. A skill becomes a habit becomes personality. Many young adults are shocked when they enter the workforce and realize adults rarely speak in pure truth. They realize almost nobody tells the full story. They realize almost every conversation is shaped by power, and if a young adult doesn't have moral insulation, they may react with bitterness. They may decide that since everyone is masked, masking is justified. They may join the system to protect themselves from humiliation. The mask becomes survival, but the mask has a psychological cost. It turns life into acting. It kills the ability to trust your own perceptions. You start doubting yourself. Am I overreacting? Am I just too sensitive? You start negotiating your emotional reality until you no longer know what you truly feel. Then relationships become transactional, money becomes anxiety, identity becomes performance. You stop being a person and become a role that adapts. This is where the hidden self theme becomes real. Most people don't fail because they are stupid. They fail because they hide from the truth about their own incentives. They hide the fact that they are choosing a mask because it protects them from shame. They hide that they are afraid of being rejected. They hide that they are addicted to control, and then they blame the world. Now I want to connect something that feels contradictory but isn't. People say, why doesn't school teach the hidden rules? If it did, students would be prepared. But preparing someone for hidden rules too directly can produce a worse outcome than surprise. If you teach the method of manipulation as a survival technique, you don't prepare the student to navigate. You train them to become the type of person the